next speaker is Greg Scott, who is with the UN. Greg is the Interregional Advisor on Global Geospatial Information Management in the United Nations Statistics Division. Shorthand is UNGGIM. In his role within the Secretariat of the UN, Greg provides high-level strategic policy, technical and procedural advice, and coordination in the implementation of UNGGIM initiatives. And he's going to talk a little bit about the UNGGIM and some of the work that they're doing. For me personally, one of the benefits of being in this community is you meet some really interesting people, and I've developed a relationship and a friendship with Greg. He works really hard on these.
Okay, I just want to get this. We got a mouse at all?
It's probably underneath here.
Ah, yes.
Okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Do you know where? Or do you want to be on the net, or do you want
I
to
just want to be.
Oh, just cancel that out then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you know where you are?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thanks to the organisers and Kevin in particular for enabling me to come along today. By way of background, I'm actually a geographer and spent 20 years or so in Australian government working on a lot of issues around not only geography and mapping and the National Mapping Program, but a lot of national security initiatives as well. And I've been in the UN for the last year or so working on this new initiative. And so what I'm going to just talk about today, very briefly, I'm just going to introduce GGIM and then spend some time very much on these legal and policy issues and what those sort of challenges might look like at a bit of a global level. I'll just really quickly skirt through a few slides. There's more detail in there, so you can look at those afterwards. But in essence, GGIM it's basically a United Nations initiative. So what that means is that the 193 member states of the UN have agreed that geospatial information is an important issue and that it needs to be discussed at the highest level. And so it is actually a formal mechanism. It was created in July 2011 and it represents the member states at the highest level. And when I say the member states, that typically means the Director Generals of the National Geospatial Information Agencies within those member countries. But uniquely, it also includes relevant international organisations and private sector as well. So it includes international agencies, OGC, FIG, ICA, IHO, WMO, etc., etc. So those international organisations and a number of private sector agencies. The initiative is really bringing a committee together to actually look at making decisions around geospatial information. And so it's very much aligned at not technology so much, not about applications, tools, these sorts of things, but very much about looking at the policy institutional arrangements, governance, legal frameworks, and some of those global issues that tend to be quite difficult but do elevate to a global level, particularly when you think of things like we saw last year with Rio +20, sustainable development, the Millennium Development Goals, humanitarian needs, natural disasters, etc. So it does become pretty important. And one of the big things is, what do we do about the developing countries? Why did we look at this, or the UN sort of come to this decision? It was really around trying to understand, and this started back in 2008, 2009, was a lot of the gaps around the management of geospatial information and the variability in how it's been applied, used and understood. And thinking about the relevance of each country having its own information and that information is reliable and trusted. And what is the role of the private sector in that? Bearing in mind that government can't do it all, the private sector can't do it all. A few of the issues around some of this, and I won't go into this in detail, you can read it yourself, but really that governments at the end of the day do, whether we agree or not, often have the mandate in policy development and decision making to basically make those decisions on behalf of the people. And is the right geospatial information being brought to bear? Is it relevant? Is it fit for purpose? And is it timely? And how is that related to the policy of the day and how that's been developed? And that's really one of the critical things that we've sort of really been struggling with. And it has a vision at the end of the day as well. We need to involve academia, private sector, governments, international organisations, but it's really about trying to make this information readily available. But it's also how we deal with this very temporal, citizen, community-based information and what that means to governments, to community, and those issues around legal and privacy issues. So the activities over the last 2 years, as I said, GGIM is only 2 years old. It was established in July 2011. We're not even 2 years in yet. But a couple of the activities that we looked at was very early on was an inventory of issues. So with all of the member states looking at, okay, what are your big issues and what would that inventory look like? And on the screen you can basically see those main themes. And what I'll just pull on today is the one very much around the issues around advocacy and trends in information technology, and very much around the common frameworks, legal and common frameworks. I'll start off with the trends in information technology. The legal and common frameworks, institutional arrangements are basically saying, well, we don't really know how we're going to approach or develop some of these issues. And so it got wrapped into a trends in information technology paper that's been developed over the last year or so. What that was about was saying, okay, if we were to bring some of the world's leaders together in thinking about the trends in geospatial information and the technology associated with it, these were the 5 main themes that came out of that. And it got discussed pretty heavily last year on the margins of the World Geospatial Forum in Amsterdam. And these thought leaders came together and they teased out these 5 major themes. And what I'd like to talk about today is the legal and policy developments section of that. Bearing in mind that it is, and I've put the web link on there for the document, that what it represents is that global thought leadership. It doesn't represent the UN and it doesn't represent individual agencies. So what did they think? The first one was around funding in a changing world, and I guess that's about, okay, how does government look at how it secures funding when you see so much information now being made available out there on the web and other environments. So what they considered was that funding for the majority of the national geospatial information agencies in many of the countries is still going to be heavily reliant on the public purse or central government. But in that, the internet and the creative industries that have been created, that have been evolving, have shaken that model, and that model will probably need to be revisited and adopted in different ways. The funding itself, in terms of the collection, maintenance, always seems to be very cost heavy, whereas out in the community, in examples like OpenStreetMap and others, is that information has been captured very, very cheaply and very, very readily, and also timely. So the argument to policy people and ministers around how they secure that funding needs to be, is now being revisited, and we're seeing that in a number of countries where it's a lot more difficult to secure some of this funding. The task will be for these geospatial information agencies to actually demonstrate the value and how they're keeping up with the pace in doing that. And that information needs to, at the same time, become increasingly free at the point of use. So if the public purse is funding data acquisition, that data acquisition needs to be moved on into the community itself without extra cost. And it's also inevitable that reductions in funding will also drive greater collaboration with the private sector and international organisations. And it's all about efficiencies and effectiveness. In open data, the requirement for greater transparency is going to be continuing across governments. It also drives access for government data. and particularly the raw data rather than processed or complete data. There's a lot of the community now is trying to seek the actual raw or source data, and what does that mean and what's the implications in that. Access to government generated information free at the point of use, and the demand for that is likely to continue, but it's happening in an uneven way. The main driver behind this will be the widespread availability of other mapping information at free at the point of use. And when I say in an uneven way, the ability to basically make available, distribute, and get access to that information does vary a lot across the many countries, both developed and undeveloped, but even in the transitional countries as well. A lot of the funding models mean that the data that needs to be maintained and released as open data are not there. So how do we actually look at those models? And then questions then will arise from the policymakers as to the costs and benefits of making data open, and what's the benefit back to that, and how do we maintain and sustain it. So that maintenance is always going to be an issue in terms of public costs. The licensing, pricing and data ownership. This one is really about looking at this demand and price and cost and what's free and what's not for free, what do we really term free, what's really, people say is free but it's not really the source data or the true data, it's aggregated information. These sorts of things are also a major challenge, and the way that the investments are made in that data maintenance and acquisition are always going to be a challenge. At the same time, we're seeing that there's an increasing pressure to monitor and license information, and are we needing to do that actually at the feature level rather than at a data layer or a data theme, and what's that going to mean to us in the future? And there's going to be a growth. There's going to be exponential growth in the amount of data that's made available, those that are in collecting it, those that are processing it, and then the value-add services that go on to that by industry in the private sector. And those interconnectivities between those types of data and then the ownership or the intellectual property around those becomes very blurred very, very quickly. So the legal frameworks are going to be extremely important. The potentially greater supervision and regulation of this industry and the legal frameworks around the data and information is, as you all are aware, is going to be a major challenge. Privacy. We've lumped this under privacy data standards and policies, but in essence, this is going to be the key issue in terms of when more data becomes available, particularly when it's real-time information, and particularly when citizens are providing that. Either they are the providers or the consumers of information, and now, as we know, they are becoming the censors as well. So we have this thought that citizens are concerned about privacy, they're concerned about confidentiality and their personal information, and they're concerned of how this information is going to be used by the private sector and also by governments. But at the same time, we're seeing that many people out there, particularly the younger generations, have a desire to make their information freely available, including driver's licenses. And so that's going to be a major conundrum for the industry for a while. There's also a growing increase in the ability for people, governments, individuals, industries to observe the citizen a lot more. And that has real benefits, particularly when we think about disaster management, humanitarian needs, emergency response, etc. But it also has its drawbacks in terms of what does that mean for national laws, for oversight bodies, and actually how do we ensure that control is exercised over this information, and is it appropriate? Citizens move across the globe as well. We move from country to country. We move from location to location. And in so doing, we don't change our profile out there on the web. We don't change our profile on Facebook. But as we move from country to country, those laws of the land change. And are we aware of that? And what does that mean for data and information at the same time? And we saw some of those examples yesterday. So is there a sacrifice of information rights and privacy in that? Government has a role in adopting and formalising open and common standards. but the geospatial information community has to be part of that. And so we need to actually start exploiting opportunities in the exploration of this. And governments tend not to do that so well. They tend to, as we've heard already this morning, let the others take the lead and follow. But I think the gap between the lead and the follow is actually getting wider and wider. And so that relevance of the roles of governments is really going to be one of the big challenges that government players need to start considering. One of the big things that we, just to finally think about too, is getting the best from this informal volunteer information and how we actually look at how government has clear goals around getting appropriate mechanisms to be able to use and deliver that information in the future. Liability in the issue of data assurance. Geospatial information agencies typically they have avoided a lot of the liability issues out there, and they tend to do this just through disclaimers and protecting themselves from risk or litigation. But what we're seeing now is that if people do start considering taking legal redress, what's the loss, and is that demonstrable? And this trend's starting to grow as well. So what we need to think about is, when we're making information available, how do we do this? How do we license it? What's the liability? And it could take one of three forms. One is to basically accept that risk in some form, to adopt legislation to mitigate or to minimise that litigation risk, or to maybe consider warranted data models. And by that means you might have a higher cost for your data, but it's warranted as being more appropriate and reliable, and at the same time more temporal than what we might typically see. So there's considerations for those different models. There's also disparities between legal and policy frameworks. And what we're seeing across the UN countries is that it's really going to be difficult to get the balance right. We have different regions around the world. When you think about Europe, it's very different to the Africas. The Americas is very different to the Asia Pacific. The Middle East is very different to the CIS countries. So what does that mean in terms of legal and policy frameworks, and how do we deal with it? There's certainly going to be a major divide that we need to try and bring together, but that's going to take time, and that's not always going to be completely achievable. So we need to think about how that works. So there's some of the major legal and policy challenges that are in this report that was considered by industry. What I'll just do now is quickly finish off with a bit of work in progress, and this is a questionnaire that's going out to the member states, and what I've just got here is a quick example of responses from 13 nations, and we're doing this in conjunction with Kevin in the centre. But these are just some initial responses back on some issues affecting geospatial information collection, use and delivery of. And as you can see here, in terms of the issues such as privacy, licensing, copyright, liability, etc., many of the member states are saying, yep, it's a problem. It's a great problem, but we don't really know what to do about it. So across all three of those graphs, you can see great deal and some are pretty high. This is around the use, and then also distribute and share. Really, really dominant. And this is just the start of this survey, but I just thought it would be nice to share it and get an understanding of the fact that some of these legal and policy challenges are very much front and centre with the global community now. So I'll just summarise very, very quickly, and I guess some of the key takeaways is that from what we're seeing and what I'm seeing is that these challenges, these issues, they're the same. They're the same everywhere. It's not unique in a particular country or in a particular region. They are hitting us like a train. And so what we need to think about what that means in terms of a government perspective, but at the same time, what does that mean with the community that are out there as sensors? And at the same time, in terms of policy, what's government seen as the benefit of geospatial information? There's still a massive education of policymakers and decision makers and ministers that still need to take place to get a better understanding. Governments have a role out there as a provider and enabler of legal and policy frameworks. but they're actually really struggling on how to do that. They don't know where they fit, they don't know how it works with the private sector, with what's happening in the community space, particularly temporal versus older information, and at the same time what those rules of engagement and the implications of those are. And that's really what they're searching for into GGIM as a committee to try and understand. So what we're trying to do is engage with the member states and actually really bring some of these issues to the table in a major way. That would then get reported up through the UN to the General Assembly. My last slide, this is just a bit of an example. We've got the third session of the committee is happening in Cambridge in the United Kingdom in July. And as I said, we're only 2 years young, but we actually now have a major agenda item of discussion, and that is literally legal and policy frameworks, including critical issues related to authoritative data. What that is about is saying, well, we've got these legal and policy challenges, but at the same time, how do we deal fundamentally as government agencies and Director Generals of Geospatial Information Organisations with data that we are typically mandated to look after and be custodians of, versus all that other information that's out there, and how do we start considering the integration of those. Thank you very much.